He ignored a boy's plea on a hectic morning, but fate wouldn't let him walk away. Ethan Caldwell, a New York hotshot, found more than he bargained for in a pair of hazel eyes. A story of lost years and second chances. Can one act fix a decade's silence? Dive in. The Upper West Side woke slowly under a pale Monday sky, its tree-lined streets still cloaked in the hush of dawn as New York City stirred to life. Ethan Caldwell stepped from his luxury apartment building, the glass doors whispering shut behind him with a soft thud. At 38, he cut a sharp figure, his tailored charcoal suit pressed to perfection, a navy tie knotted with precision, and an Italian leather briefcase swinging lightly in his grip. The chill of early spring nipped at his ears, but he barely noticed, his gray eyes darting to the sleek wristwatch on his left arm. 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes until a pivotal meeting at Caldwell and Partners, one of the city's most formidable law firms. His polished loafers clicked against the sidewalk, a hurried rhythm echoing through the near-empty streets, the city that never sleeps still, rubbing its eyes awake. Ethan's breath puffed in faint clouds as he moved, his mind already dissecting the day ahead. A negotiation with Apex Industries executives, a chance to lock in a multi-million-dollar retainer. He checked his watch again, the third time in 5 minutes, his pace quickening as the deadline loomed. The world around him blurred into a backdrop of gray concrete and budding trees, dog walkers, delivery vans, the occasional jogger, all mere obstacles sidestepped with practiced ease. To Ethan, they were shadows, irrelevant to the trajectory of his success, a path he'd carved with a relentless focus that left little room for distraction. His sharp eyes, usually attuned to every detail in a contract or courtroom, skimmed past the faces he crossed, registering them only as fleeting blips in his peripheral vision. Turning onto West 72nd Street, his stride faltered. A small figure blocked the sidewalk, a jarring interruption to his calculated march. A boy, no older than 10, stood rooted in the middle, his thin frame dwarfed by a faded red hoodie 2 sizes too big. His unkempt brown hair spilled over his forehead, and his sneakers, scuffed and peeling, shifted nervously as he clutched a dented metal tin brimming with cookies. "Hey, mister," he mumbled, his voice a fragile thread trembling in the crisp air. "Want to buy some sweets? They're for my school." His hazel eyes, wide and hopeful, lifted to meet Ethan's, a flicker of light in a face too gaunt for a child. Ethan's irritation flared, his piercing gray eyes narrowing as he towered over the boy. "Out of the way, kid," he growled, his tone clipped and cold, a reflex honed by years of brushing aside anything, or anyone, that slowed his ascent. He sidestepped, his shoulder brushing the boy with more force than intended, a shove that sent the tin tumbling from small hands. Cookies scattered across the pavement, chocolate chips, oatmeal raisins, a pitiful assortment crunching underfoot as Ethan's loafers pressed on without a pause. The boy's sharp gasp cut through the morning quiet. A sound Ethan didn't hear, his focus already shifting back to his watch, his meeting, his world of glass towers and legal victories. He didn't look back, didn't see the child drop to his knees, scrambling to gather the broken pieces, tears welling in those hazel eyes, as an expression of hurt and resignation settled over his face. A weight no 10-year-old should carry. The streets grew busier as Ethan neared the firm, the hum of taxis and early commuters swelling into the familiar roar of Manhattan's pulse. He adjusted his tie, smoothing a stray lock of dark hair as he pushed through the revolving doors of Caldwell and Partners, its marble lobby gleaming with the polish of prestige. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was swift, the mirrored walls reflecting a man who'd built an empire of influence. Partner by 35, a name whispered in boardrooms across the city. His assistant, Rachel, waited at his office door, her auburn hair pulled into a neat bun, a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and a stack of files in the other. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice bright but clipped, handing him the coffee. "Your Apex meeting's in 10. Conference room's ready." Ethan nodded, taking the cup, its heat seeping through the porcelain as he flipped through the files. Contracts, clauses, leverage points for Apex Industries. "Any messages?" he asked, his tone brisk, already mentally drafting his opening salvo. Rachel hesitated, her green eyes flickering with a hint of unease. "Well, one thing. Marcus Tate called. Said it's urgent. Asked you to call back as soon as you can." The name jolted him, a sudden crack in his polished facade. Marcus Tate, his law school brother-in-arms, the friend he'd shared late-night study sessions and wild dreams with, until ambition and silence stretched a decade between them. Marcus, he muttered more to himself, his brow furrowing as memories stirred. Coffee-stained casebooks, promises of loyalty, a friendship faded by time. He shook it off, shoving the past back into its box. "I'll deal with it later," he said, his voice firm, brushing past Rachel toward the conference room. "Let's get Apex locked in first." She nodded, falling into step behind him. But the echo of Marcus's name lingered, a faint whisper tugging at the edges of his focus, a thread he couldn't yet pull. The morning collision with the boy faded too, a fleeting annoyance buried beneath the weight of his day, cookies crunching underfoot, a child's hurt, unseen. Ethan strode into the conference room, his mind razor sharp, unaware that the boy on the sidewalk held a key to a past he'd long ignored, a collision set to unravel the life he'd so carefully built. Ethan Caldwell crossed the threshold of the conference room at Caldwell and Partners, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind him with a muted thud that sealed out the hum of the 32nd floor. The space gleamed with the polish of power, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a jagged Manhattan skyline, a long glass table reflecting the morning light, and a dozen leather chairs awaiting the Apex Industries executives. His gray eyes flicked to the clock above, 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes until showtime, his pulse steady despite the stakes. The files Rachel had handed him sat tucked under his arm, an arsenal of contracts and leverage points he'd memorized overnight, ready to wield like a blade in the negotiation ahead. He set his coffee down, its bitter steam curling upward, and adjusted his cufflinks, the silver glinting as a faint echo tugged at his mind. Marcus Tate's name, a whisper he'd shoved aside with a curt, "I'll deal with it later." The executives filed out, Rachel trailing to finalize paperwork, and Ethan returned to his office, the glass walls muting the floor's hum as he shut the door. He sank into his leather chair, the skyline stretching beyond, a battlefield he'd conquered, tower by tower. The Apex files sat triumphant on his desk, but his gaze drifted to the phone, Rachel's scribbled note beside it. Marcus Tate, urgent, call back ASAP. The name hit harder now, unshaken by the meeting's rush, a pebble lodged in the gears of his mind. Marcus Tate, his law school shadow, the friend who'd matched his late-night casebook marathons with a grin and a beer, their dreams of justice and glory once intertwined. They'd vowed to stay tight, brothers beyond the bar, but ambition had pulled Ethan upward, silence stretching a decade between them. He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling sharply as memories surfaced. Marcus's infectious laugh in their cramped dorm, the night they'd sworn to never let success split them, the slow fade as Ethan chased partnerships, and Marcus took a quieter path. Calls unanswered, emails unreturned, Ethan had built a fortress of focus, but Marcus's voice lingered, a crack in its walls. "What's so urgent now?" he muttered, more to himself, his fingers hovering over the receiver. Rachel's hesitant tone replayed, "He said it's urgent." And a flicker of unease stirred, a shadow he couldn't pin. He'd brushed it off earlier, Apex's millions demanding his edge, but now, alone, the whisper grew louder, insistent. The office hummed beyond his door, phones ringing, heels clicking, a rhythm he'd mastered, but Marcus's name broke its cadence. He picked up the receiver, then set it down, pacing to the window. The city sprawled below, a chessboard he'd played to perfection. Yet this call tugged at a corner he'd ignored. Friendship, loyalty, a past he'd boxed away with his old casebooks. He glanced back at the note, Rachel's neat script, a quiet accusation, and grabbed the phone again, dialing before doubt could stall him. It rang once, his pulse quickened, twice, and he braced for voicemail, but on the third, a voice answered, tired yet achingly familiar. "Hello?" "Marcus, it's Ethan," he said, his tone clipped, masking the jolt of hearing his friend after so long. A pause stretched, heavy with years, before Marcus replied, his voice a mix of relief and strain. "Ethan, I wasn't sure you'd call." Ethan's throat tightened, guilt creeping in. How many calls had he dodged? But he pushed it down. "Rachel said it's urgent. What's going on?" Another silence, longer, and Marcus's next words landed like a punch. "It's my son, Noah. He's been missing for 3 years." Ethan's breath caught, the room tilting as Marcus's plea sank in. 3 years, and a faint echo stirred, a boy's trembling voice from the morning. "Want to buy some sweets?" He gripped the phone, his mind racing. Brown hair, hazel eyes, a skinny frame. Details Marcus hadn't yet shared, but ones Ethan couldn't shake. "Marcus? Tell me everything. What does he look like?" His voice sharpened, urgency breaking through his polished calm, the apex victory fading as a new stakes emerged. The line crackled with Marcus's ragged breath, and Ethan knew this call wasn't just a reconnection. It was a collision with a past he'd left behind, one that might unravel everything he'd built. Marcus's ragged breath filled the pause, a sound heavy with years Ethan hadn't witnessed. "He's 10 now," Marcus said, his tone fraying at the edges. Brown hair, kinda messy, hazel eyes, big for his face, skinny kid, always was, bites his lip when he's nervous. The description slammed into Ethan, each word a hammer chiseling at the memory of the morning's collision. The boy on West 72nd Street. His thin frame, untamed hair, those wide hazel eyes locking onto his before Ethan shoved him aside. His throat tightened, the coffee on his desk cold and forgotten, its steam long dissipated. 3 years? He rasped, gripping the phone harder, guilt clawing up his spine. 3 years Marcus had carried this, while Ethan chased retainers and corner offices. "I tried reaching you before," Marcus said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and a bitterness Ethan couldn't miss. "In the beginning, called a dozen times, left messages. You were always in meetings, always climbing. After a while, I stopped. Figured it was too late." Ethan's jaw clenched, his free hand curling into a fist as memories of ignored calls flickered. Voicemails he'd deleted without listening. Emails buried under client briefs. He'd built a fortress of success at Caldwell and Partners, each brick laid with a focus that left no room for the past. But Marcus's words cracked it open, exposing the friend he'd let slip away. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I didn't know," he said, the apology tasting hollow, his polished facade crumbling under the weight of what he'd missed. Marcus sighed, a sound that carried a decade of distance. "It's not your fault. I don't blame you for moving on. But I'm desperate now, Ethan. The police gave up 2 years ago, said he'd probably run off, another street kid lost in the system. I need help." Ethan paced to the window, his loafers silent on the plush carpet, staring at the jagged towers piercing the sky. A battlefield he'd mastered, yet one that felt trivial now. "What happened, Marcus? How'd he go missing?" he asked, his lawyer's instinct kicking in, probing for details to anchor the chaos swirling in his chest. Another pause, longer, and Marcus's voice dropped, raw with a pain Ethan hadn't heard since their law school days. "It was Sarah, my wife. She wasn't well, bipolar, undiagnosed for years. I tried to get her help, but she wouldn't listen, said I was the crazy one. 3 years ago, she had a bad episode, manic, out of control. I stepped out for half an hour to grab her meds from the pharmacy, came back, and they were gone. Her and Noah just vanished." Ethan's breath caught, his mind flashing to the boy's gaunt face, the resignation in those hazel eyes, a child alone for 3 years. "She died a year later," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "Cops found her in a shelter, overdose. Noah wasn't with her. I've been looking ever since." Ethan sank into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, his free hand rubbing his temple as Marcus's story sank in. 3 years, he muttered, more to himself, the timeline a gut punch. 3 years of Marcus searching, while Ethan built an empire, oblivious. "Why didn't you push harder? Make me listen." Marcus's laugh was bitter, short. "I did, Ethan. Sent letters, even showed up once. Your receptionist said you were indisposed. I got it. You were the big shot, and I was the guy who took the public defender gig. We drifted. Happens." The words stung, a mirror to Ethan's choices, his relentless climb leaving Marcus a ghost in his wake. "I'll help you, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice firm, cutting through the haze of guilt. "Whatever it takes, I'll find him." He didn't know how, not yet, but the boy from the sidewalk loomed in his mind. Brown hair, hazel eyes, a nervous lip bite, a match too close to dismiss. "Tell me more. Where'd you last see him? Any leads?" Marcus exhaled, relief threading his tone. "Last trace was Brooklyn, 2 years back. A shelter worker thought they saw him, but he bolted. Cops said he's probably still in the city. Street kids don't go far. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. Brooklyn, a needle in New York's haystack, but a start. He hung up, the receiver clicking into place as silence settled, heavy and thick. His office, sleek desk, skyline view, Apex files triumphant, felt suddenly hollow. A stage for a life he'd curated with precision, yet one that had cost him Marcus, maybe more. The boy's face flashed again, those cookies crunching underfoot, his small gasp, and Ethan's stomach twisted, a dread he couldn't name. He grabbed his coat, the leather cool against his skin, and bolted from the office, ignoring Rachel's startled, "Mr. Caldwell," as he passed. His loafers hit the pavement outside, the city's roar swallowing his steps as he raced back to West 72nd Street, driven by a fear he hadn't felt in years, fear that the boy he'd dismissed was Noah, and that his own indifference might have delayed a reunion Marcus had begged for. Ethan Caldwell burst through the revolving doors of Caldwell and Partners, the marble lobby blurring as his polished loafers slapped the pavement outside. The Monday afternoon air hit him sharp and cold, a spring breeze cutting through his tailored charcoal suit as he plunged into the pulse of New York City. His gray eyes, usually narrowed with courtroom precision, darted wildly, past honking taxis, dog walkers, a street vendor hawking pretzels, searching for a glimpse of the boy he'd shoved aside that morning on West 72nd Street. Marcus Tate's voice crackled in his mind. Brown hair, hazel eyes, skinny. A description that matched the child he'd dismissed, now a haunting echo driving his sprint. His leather briefcase swung forgotten in his grip, a relic of the Apex Industries win that felt trivial against the dread twisting his gut. The streets surged with midday chaos, suits weaving through tourists, horns blaring, the city's relentless rhythm swallowing his hurried steps. He'd left Rachel gaping at his office door, her startled "Mr. Caldwell?" unanswered as he'd bolted, propelled by a fear he hadn't felt since his first case, a fear of being too late, of losing something he hadn't known mattered. Marcus's plea, "He's been missing for 3 years," rang louder with every block, a drumbeat of guilt over calls ignored, a decade of silence that had left his friend's son adrift. Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts, his tie loosening as he pushed past a cluster of pedestrians, their grumbles fading into the roar of his pulse. West 72nd Street loomed ahead, its tree-lined stretch quieter than the avenues, brownstones casting long shadows in the slanting light. He slowed, chest heaving, his eyes scouring the sidewalk where he'd collided with the boy hours ago, where cookies had crunched underfoot, where a small voice had faltered. The pavement lay bare now, no tin, no scattered sweets, just a few passers-by strolling with coffee cups or leashed dogs. Ethan's stomach sank, dread clawing deeper. Had he lost him already? He spun, scanning stoops and alleys, his lawyer's logic battling a rising panic. "Come on, kid," he muttered, a plea to the empty street, his hands clenching the briefcase straps as if they could anchor him. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the street, on the steps of a weathered brownstone, a small figure sat hunched, knees drawn up, a dented metal tin glinting beside him. Ethan's breath caught. The boy's faded red hoodie sagged over his thin frame, his unkempt brown hair spilling over his forehead. A match to Marcus's words that stopped Ethan cold. He crossed without looking, a taxi's horn blaring as he dodged its bumper, his focus locked on the child. The boy stared into nothingness, his hands clasped tight, defeat etched in his slumped shoulders, a weight too heavy for 10 years, a mirror to the hurt Ethan had glimpsed that morning before he'd walked away. Ethan slowed, his loafers scuffing the curb as he approached, his throat tight with a mix of hope and shame. He knelt, bringing himself to the boy's level, the leather of his shoes creaking against the concrete. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years, stripped of the growl he'd used hours ago. "I'm sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to knock your stuff over." The boy's head snapped up, hazel eyes wide with recognition, then narrowing with a flash of fear. Those same eyes that had met his before, now guarded, wary. Ethan swallowed, his palms damp despite the chill. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, his thin fingers tightening on his knees, his gaze flicking to the tin as if it could shield him. "Noah, he whispered, the word barely audible, a fragile thread that snapped Ethan's world into focus. His breath hitched, the name a thunderclap. Noah, Marcus's son, the boy he'd pushed aside without a second glance. Ethan's mind raced, guilt surging as he pieced it together. 3 years missing, surviving on these streets, and he'd been right there, a fleeting chance he'd nearly lost. Noah, he repeated, testing it, his voice steady despite the storm inside. That's a good name. I'm Ethan. Noah's eyes searched his, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the fear, but he stayed silent, his small frame tense as if ready to bolt. Ethan shifted, easing the briefcase to the ground, his hands open, a gesture of peace, not power. I owe you an apology, he said, meeting those hazel eyes with a sincerity he rarely showed in the court. I was in a rush this morning. Shouldn't have pushed you. How about I make it up? Buy all your cookies? Noah's brows shot up, surprise softening his guard. All of them? He asked, his voice husky, skepticism threading through. Why? Ethan managed a faint smile, his lawyer's mind grasping for footing in this uncharted terrain. Let's call it a peace offering, he said, his tone light but firm. And maybe we could talk a bit, get something warm to eat. What do you say? Noah bit his lip, a nervous tic Marcus had described, his gaze darting to the street, then back to Ethan. After a long moment, he nodded, slow and tentative. A crack in his armor Ethan seized like a lifeline. Good, he said, rising and offering a hand, which Noah ignored, standing on his own, tin clutch tight. They crossed to a nearby deli, the bell jingling as Ethan held the door, the scent of pastrami and fresh bread wafting out. Noah hesitated, then stepped inside, his sneakers scuffing the tiles as Ethan ordered sandwiches and cocoa, guiding him to a corner booth. The boy sat, his shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the room, wary, guarded, a child too used to running. Ethan sat across, his briefcase a silent witness beside him, and studied Noah, the gaunt cheeks, the too big hoodie, the echoes of Marcus in his face. Noah, he said gently, sliding a cocoa across, I'm glad I found you again. There's someone who's been looking for you, a long time. The boy froze, his hazel eyes locking onto Ethan's, a question trembling there as the search began to bear its first fragile fruit. Who? He asked, his voice husky, barely above a whisper, his fingers tightening on the mug until his knuckles whitened. Ethan hesitated, the weight of Marcus Tate's plea. He's been missing for 3 years, pressing against his chest, but he held back the name, sensing the fragility of this moment. Someone who cares about you, he said instead, choosing his words like steps on thin ice. But first, eat. You look hungry. Noah bit his lip, a nervous tic Marcus had mentioned, his gaze dropping to the sandwich, then flicking back to Ethan, weighing him. After a long beat, he nodded, slow and tentative, and reached for the bread, tearing off a small piece with fingers that shook faintly. Ethan watched, his throat tightening as Noah took a cautious bite, then another, hunger overriding wariness as he devoured the pastrami with a quiet ferocity. The deli hummed around them, waitresses clattering plates, a radio crooning Sinatra, but their booth felt like a pocket of stillness, a fragile truce forming over crumbs and cocoa. Ethan sipped his own drink, the warmth grounding him as he studied the boy. Gaunt cheeks, shadowed eyes, a resilience etched in every line that shouldn't belong to a 10-year-old. You're good at selling cookies, Ethan said, breaking the silence with a faint smile, aiming to ease the tension. How long you been at it? Noah paused mid-chew, swallowing hard, his hazel eyes darting to the tin on the table, dented, half empty, a lifeline he'd clung to. A while, he mumbled, shrugging, his voice flat but guarded. Move around a lot. Streets, shelters. People buy sometimes. Ethan's chest ached, the casualness of it cutting deeper than any courtroom loss. The boy's life, a patchwork of survival. No trace of the home Marcus had lost him from. No parents? He asked, keeping his tone light, though the question burned. Noah's shoulders stiffened, his fingers crumbling a piece of bread into dust. Nope, he said, his voice a brittle thread, avoiding Ethan's gaze. Just me. The words landed heavy, a door slamming shut, and Ethan let them settle, sensing the pain behind the brevity. He'd pushed a boy aside that morning, cookies crunching underfoot, a fleeting annoyance, never imagining this weight, this story. Must be tough, he said, his voice soft, not pressing further. "You're tougher than I was at 10. I'd have cried if someone knocked my stuff over." A flicker crossed Noah's face. Not a smile, but a softening, his guard easing as he took another bite. The deli's bell jingled, a family bustling in, laughter, chatter, and Noah's eyes darted to them, then back to his mug, a shadow passing over his thin features. Ethan shifted, setting his cocoa down, his lawyer's instinct nudging him to build a bridge. "Where did you sleep last night?" he asked, casual but deliberate, threading trust into the question. Noah shrugged again, his hoodie sleeve slipping to reveal a wrist too bony for a child. Found a spot by some steps, better than the wind." Ethan's jaw tightened, picturing the brownstone stoop where he'd found him, the boy curled against cold stone, a life Marcus couldn't fathom, one Ethan had stumbled into by chance. "You shouldn't have to sleep outside," Ethan said, his tone firm but gentle, leaning in. "Not tonight anyway. How about you crash with me? I've got a spare room, warm bed, no strings." Noah's head snapped up, suspicion flaring anew, his hazel eyes searching Ethan's face for a catch. "Why?" he asked, his voice sharp, a street-hardened edge cutting through. "You don't know me." Ethan met his stare, unflinching. "I know you're a kid who deserves better than steps, and I owe you for this morning. One night, see how it goes?" Noah bit his lip again, his fingers tracing the tin's edge, a war raging behind those eyes. Trust versus survival, hope versus habit. After a long silence, he nodded, barely perceptible, a crack in his armor Ethan seized like a lifeline. "Good," he said, rising and tossing a few bills on the table, the sandwich wrappers crinkling as he cleared them. "Let's get out of here. Grab your tin." Noah stood, slow and cautious, clutching his meager haul, his sneakers scuffing the tiles as he followed Ethan to the door. The city's dusk greeted them, horns blaring, lights flaring, as Ethan hailed a cab, the boy's small frame dwarfed beside him. "Where are we going?" Noah asked, his voice a whisper swallowed by the street's roar. "My place, Upper West Side," Ethan replied, opening the cab door. Warm, safe, promise. The taxi wove through traffic, Noah peering out the window, his hazel eyes wide at the towers looming taller with each block. Ethan watched him, Marcus's voice echoing. "He's been missing for 3 years," and felt a resolve harden. This wasn't just a boy he'd found. It was a chance to right a wrong, to stitch a thread he'd let unravel. "Noah," he said as the cab slowed, "that's someone looking for you? He's been trying real hard to find you." The boy turned, his gaze piercing, a question trembling there. "Who?" But Ethan held back, waiting, knowing trust was a fragile seed needing time to root before it could bloom. The taxi hummed through New York's dusk, its tires a steady thrum against the asphalt, as Ethan Caldwell sat beside Noah, the boy's small frame pressed against the window, hazel eyes wide at the Upper West Side's looming towers. Streetlights flickered to life, casting golden streaks across Noah's faded red hoodie, too big, swallowing his thin shoulders, and the dented tin of cookies clutched tight in his lap. Ethan's leather briefcase rested between his feet, a relic of a Monday morning that felt lifetimes ago, his gray eyes flicking to Noah with a mix of resolve and unease. "My place, Upper West Side," he'd said, ushering the boy into the cab, his voice steady despite the question trembling in Noah's gaze. "Who's looking for me?" A thread Ethan held taut, waiting for the right moment to unravel. The cab slowed at West 83rd Street, pulling up to Ethan's luxury building, a sleek tower of glass and steel, its doorman nodding as they stepped out. Noah hesitated, his scuffed sneakers rooted to the sidewalk, his eyes tracing the building's height with a flicker of awe. "Wow," he whispered, barely audible, his breath puffing in the cool evening air. Ethan managed a faint smile, his hand hovering near Noah's shoulder but not touching. Too soon, too fragile. "Come on," he said softly, guiding him through the glass doors, the marble lobby gleaming under recessed lights, a stark contrast to the streets Noah had roamed. The elevator ride was silent, Noah's gaze darting to the mirrored walls, reflecting a man and a boy who'd collided by chance, now bound by something unspoken. Ethan's apartment opened with a click, a wave of polished wood and modern elegance washing over them, hardwood floors stretching to a wall of windows, abstract art in muted blues, a leather sofa that cost more than most rents. Noah stopped in the doorway, his tin clutched tighter, his thin frame dwarfed by the space. "You live here alone?" he asked, his husky voice tinged with disbelief, stepping cautiously onto the polished floor. Ethan nodded, shedding his coat. "Yeah, but tonight you're here too. Make yourself at home." He led Noah down a hallway, the boy's sneakers scuffing softly to a guest room, spacious, with a king-size bed piled high with crisp white linens, a contrast to the stoop Ethan had found him on. Noah sank onto the mattress, its give swallowing his slight weight, his hazel eyes wide as he traced the room's edges, clean walls, a dresser, a door to a private bathroom. Ethan set a stack of clothes on the bed, an old t-shirt and shorts, oversized but clean, his voice gentle. "Take a bath if you want. Towels are in there. I'll whip up some food." Noah nodded, biting his lip, his fingers brushing the tin as Ethan left, closing the door with a quiet click. In the kitchen, he pulled ingredients from the fridge, eggs, bread, a stick of butter, his hands moving on autopilot as his mind churned. Marcus's plea, he's been missing for 3 years, and Noah's wariness, no parents, collided, a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. The sizzle of eggs filled the air, a simple omelet taking shape, as Ethan's thoughts drifted to the boy's gaunt face, his guarded words at the deli. Move around a lot, a life Marcus couldn't fathom, one Ethan had stumbled into. Footsteps padded behind him, and he turned. Noah stood in the doorway, damp hair curling over his forehead, the t-shirt hanging past his knees, his bare feet silent on the hardwood. "Feeling better?" Ethan asked, sliding a plate onto the island, a slice of toast beside the eggs. Noah nodded shyly, climbing onto a stool. "Thanks for the clothes," he mumbled, his voice soft, a crack in his armor Ethan welcomed with a smile. "Eat up, plenty more where that came from." They ate in near silence, Noah devouring the meal with a hunger that twisted Ethan's gut, his own plate barely touched. When Noah finished, scraping the last bite, Ethan set his fork down, his lawyer's instinct nudging him forward. "Noah," he said, his tone careful, "you don't have to tell me anything you don't want, but where'd you come from before the streets?" The boy tensed, his hazel eyes dropping to the empty plate, his fingers curling into fists. "Don't remember much," he muttered, his voice flat, a wall rising fast. "Just been moving, shelters, alleys, no one sticks around." Ethan nodded, letting the silence settle, then leaned in, his voice softer. "What if I told you someone's been looking for you? Not just anyone, but family." Noah's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, suspicion flaring anew. "Family?" he echoed, his tone sharp, a street-hardened edge cutting through. "I don't got any." Ethan's chest tightened, Marcus's pain, Noah's disbelief, a chasm he had to bridge. "Your dad," he said, the words steady, deliberate. "He's been searching for you, years." Noah's mug clattered to the island, cocoa sloshing, his face paling as he recoiled. "No, he left me. He didn't want me." The shout cracked the air, tears brimming as he slid off the stool, backing toward the hall. Ethan stood, hands raised, his voice calm but firm. "Noah, wait. I talked to him today. He's desperate to find you. Never stopped." The boy froze, his thin frame trembling, tears spilling as he shook his head. "You're lying. He sent me away." Ethan stepped closer, slow, his heart pounding. "He didn't, I swear. Something happened, and he's been trying to get you back ever since." Noah's sobs broke free, raw and ragged, and Ethan knelt, pulling him into a tentative hug, the boy stiff, then sagging, burying his face in Ethan's shoulder, years of hurt pouring out. Minutes passed, Noah's cries softening as Ethan held him, his own throat tight. When the boy quieted, Ethan pulled back, meeting those hazel eyes. "Noah, your dad's name is Marcus Tate. He's my friend. I found you by accident today, but I'm calling him now, okay?" Noah nodded, wiping his face with the oversized sleeve, exhaustion etching his features. Ethan grabbed his phone, dialing Marcus, the ring cutting through the silence. "Ethan?" Marcus answered, his voice taut. "I found him," Ethan said, his eyes on Noah. "He's safe, with me." A choked sob echoed through the line, and Ethan knew the truth was unveiled, a father's hope rekindled, a fragile trust now his to guard. Marcus's relief was a raw, broken sound, and Ethan's throat tightened, the weight of a decade's silence pressing hard as he lowered the phone, ending the call with a promise. "Come now." Noah's gaze darted to him, a question trembling there. What now? His small hands clutching the edge of the island, cocoa mug abandoned beside him. Ethan forced a smile, kneeling to meet those hazel eyes, his lawyer's polish replaced by a raw sincerity. Your dad's on his way, Noah. He's been looking for you all this time. I know it's a lot, but he's coming here. The boy's lip quivered, his thin frame tensing as if to bolt, but he nodded, slow and shaky, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Okay, he whispered, his voice hoarse, and Ethan rose, ruffling his damp brown hair, a gesture he hadn't planned, one that felt right as Noah flinched, then softened under it. The apartment hummed with a tense stillness as Ethan tidied the kitchen. Plates clattered into the sink, the omelet's remnants scraped away, his hands moving to fill the weight. Noah trailed him to the living room, sinking into the leather sofa, his sneakers dangling above the floor, the dented cookie tin, a silent sentinel beside him. Ethan paced to the window, the city's pulse a distant roar below, taxis weaving, lights flaring, a world oblivious to the reunion brewing within these walls. Marcus's words from their call replayed, "She took him? I never stopped." And Ethan's guilt gnawed deeper. A decade of dodge calls, now a bridge he had to rebuild, step by fragile step. The intercom buzzed at 9:15 p.m., sharp and insistent, jolting Ethan from his thoughts. "Mr. Caldwell, a Marcus Tate's here," the doorman's voice crackled. "Send him up," Ethan replied, his pulse quickening as he turned to Noah. "He's here. Ready?" The boy's hazel eyes widened, fear and hope warring across his gaunt face, and he nodded, clutching the tin tighter. Ethan opened the door as the elevator dinged, revealing Marcus, a man worn by years, his dark hair streaked with gray, his broad shoulders slumped under a faded jacket. His brown eyes, so like Noah's, locked onto the boy instantly. Time freezing as father and son faced each other across a chasm of 3 lost years. "Noah," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking, a single step forward as he dropped to his knees, hands trembling. The boy stood, his tin clattering to the floor, cookies scattering anew, a sound that pierced the silence as he took a hesitant step, then another. "Dad!" Noah choked, his voice a raw sob, and he ran, crashing into Marcus's arms with a force that sent them both swaying. Marcus pulled him close, his broad hands cradling Noah's head, tears streaming as he buried his face in the boy's unkempt hair. "My boy," he cried, his voice a ragged hymn of relief and pain. "My precious boy, I've missed you so much." Ethan stepped back, his throat tight, his gray eyes stinging as he watched them, Noah's small frame shaking with sobs, Marcus's shoulders heaving, a reunion stitched from years of fracture. He turned to the window, giving them space, the city's lights blurring as he blinked hard, the weight of his own absence crashing in. "I thought you didn't want me," Noah mumbled into Marcus' chest, his voice muffled, broken. "She said you sent us away." Marcus pulled back, cupping Noah's tear-streaked face, his eyes fierce with love. "Never, Noah, never. Your mom, she was sick. I tried to help her, but she took you. I never stopped looking." The words hung heavy, a truth Ethan had glimpsed in Marcus's call, Sarah's illness, her manic flight. But now it landed fresh, raw in Noah's ears. The boy's sobs softened, his thin arms tightening around Marcus, a trust rekindling as Ethan watched, a silent witness to a bond he'd helped resurrect. Marcus glanced up, his brown eyes glistening with gratitude, meeting Ethan's across the room. "Ethan," he said, his voice breaking, "I don't know how to thank you. You brought him back." Ethan shook his head, stepping closer, his voice rough. "Don't thank me, Marcus. I owed you this. Should have been there sooner." Noah pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve, his hazel eyes flicking between them, curiosity cutting through his tears. "You know each other?" he asked, his voice small but steadying. Marcus nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Ethan and I were best friends, law school, years ago, like brothers until I let life pull us apart." Ethan's chest tightened, guilt and relief warring as he crouched beside Noah. "We messed up, kid, but we're here now, both of us." Noah's lip quivered, a ghost of a smile tugging as he nodded, a fragile thread weaving them together. They moved to the sofa, Marcus cradling Noah, Ethan perched nearby, the room a cocoon against the city's chaos. "What happened, Dad?" Noah asked, his voice trembling, seeking answers Ethan knew Marcus dreaded. Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes distant. Your mom, she wasn't well. Her mind played tricks. That night, I went for her meds, thought you'd be safe. She ran with you instead. Noah's tears welled again, but he leaned into Marcus, a silent acceptance blooming. Ethan listened, his role shifting, lawyer to guardian, as the reunion sealed a promise. He'd stand by them, mending what he'd let break, a past redeemed in the boys' quiet trust. Weeks unfurled in a blur of adjustment. Tuesday dawned with Marcus and Noah leaving for a Brooklyn hotel. Ethan's guest room too small for permanence, but a lifeline for that first night. He'd stood at his window, watching their cab disappear into the city's neon glow, a promise lingering. I'm here for both of you. Days turned to phone calls and visits, Ethan weaving into their rhythm. Lunches at delis, walks through Central Park. Noah's wary hazel eyes softening with each shared laugh. Marcus rented a modest apartment near Prospect Park, its bare walls slowly filling with Noah's drawings, stars, streets, a tentative home. Ethan's luxury life at Caldwell and Partners shifted too. Cases took second place to late-night talks with Marcus, piecing together a friendship frayed by ambition. 2 weeks later, the courthouse on Center Street loomed under a slate-gray sky, its stone steps slick with morning rain, as Ethan adjusted his tie, his lawyer's poise a shield against the tension coiling in his gut. Marcus sat beside him on a wooden bench, his broad shoulders rigid in a borrowed suit, his hands clasped tight. Noah between them, his faded hoodie swapped for a clean sweater, his hazel eyes wide and restless. Across the hall, Ruth Hartley, Sarah's mother, stood with her attorney, her gray hair pulled tight, her stern face a mask of cold resolve. Ethan's jaw tightened. Ruth had arrived days after the reunion, her icy demand echoing, I'm taking my grandson home. Marcus had paled, but Ethan had stepped in, his voice firm. We'll fight this, together. The courtroom hushed as Judge Clara Thompson entered, her piercing eyes scanning the room over wire-rimmed glasses. All rise, the bailiff barked, and Ethan stood, his hand brushing Noah's shoulder, a steadying anchor as the boy clutched Marcus's sleeve. We're here to decide custody of Noah Tate, Thompson began, her tone measured. Petition from Mrs. Ruth Hartley, contested by Mr. Marcus Tate. Ruth's lawyer launched in, portraying Marcus as neglectful, a father who'd lost his son to a sick wife's whims. His public defender, days a mark of failure. Ethan countered, his voice cutting through. Marcus never abandoned Noah. Sarah's untreated bipolar disorder led to her flight. He searched tirelessly. Here's proof. He slid photos, letters, police reports across the table, evidence of Marcus's relentless hunt. Noah's turn came, and Ethan squeezed his hand as the boy stood, his sneakers scuffing the floor. Noah, Thompson said gently, how do you feel about this? The boy glanced at Marcus, then Ruth, his voice small but firm. I was mad. Thought Dad didn't want me. Mom said he sent us away, but she was sick. I get it now. He looked for me all that time. Tears glistened as he turned to Ruth. Grandma, I know you love me, but I belong with Dad. He needs me, and I need him. He faced Ethan, a faint smile breaking through. And Ethan, he found us. He's family too. Ethan's chest swelled, pride and pain mingling as Marcus gripped his arm, gratitude unspoken. Thompson deliberated, her pen tapping, then ruled, custody to Marcus Tate, full rights, Mrs. Hartley granted visitation, family matters to Noah. Marcus exhaled, pulling Noah into a fierce hug, tears streaming as Ruth nodded, her cold mask cracking with a sob. Ethan clapped Marcus's shoulder, his own eyes stinging. Redemption sealed in a child's trust. A friend's faith restored. They left the courthouse, the rain easing to a drizzle, the city's gray softening as they stepped onto the wet steps, a trio bound by more than blood. That evening, Central Park stretched dark and vast under a starlit sky. A blanket spread near the great lawn, where Ethan, Marcus, and Noah lay, the boy's tin of cookies, refilled, beside them. There's the Big Dipper, Noah said, pointing, his hazel eyes bright with a joy Ethan hadn't seen before, his thin frame relaxed against Marcus. Beautiful, Marcus murmured, his arm around his son, his voice thick as he glanced at Ethan. You're with us, right? Ethan grinned, lying back, the stars a canopy above. Wouldn't miss it. Uncle Ethan sticking around. Noah's laugh, soft, real, echoed, a sound that healed more than years could. The city's hum faded, the park a sanctuary as Ethan traced constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, his mind drifting. Ruth's visits would begin, a bridge to mend, but here, under this vast sky, a family reformed. From a lawyer's cold climb to this, a collision on West 72nd Street had undone a decade's drift, proving second chances weren't just possible, but powerful. "Thanks for finding me," Noah said, his voice sleepy and Ethan's heart clenched. "You found me too, kid," he replied, the stars above a testament to bonds rebuilt, a redemption that stretched beyond the horizon. Under New York's starry sky, Ethan, Marcus, and Noah found more than a reunion. They built a family from broken threads. From a shove on a sidewalk to a fight for love, their story proves every lost chance can spark a new start. Resilience turns strangers into kin, and one step can heal a lifetime. Hope's never too late. Claim yours.